The sound of jeers echoed through the dusty streets of Silver Creek as Margaret Fletcher hobbled down the wooden boardwalk, her face burning with humiliation. The year was 1874, and the small Montana Territory town had never been kind to those who were different. Margaret's pronounced limp, the result of a childhood fever that had left her right leg weaker than her left, made her an easy target for the town's crueler residents. "Look at her dragging that leg like a broken wagon wheel," someone called out from the saloon doorway. Margaret kept her eyes fixed on the path ahead, clutching her basket tighter against her side as she made her way to the general store. At 22, she had grown accustomed to the taunts, but that didn't make them sting any less. Her aunt had arranged a marriage for her with a widower from the next town over a man twice her age who needed someone to care for his children and keep his house. Margaret knew she should be grateful. With her condition, few men would consider her for a wife. Just 3 more days, she whispered to herself. 3 more days until she would leave Silver Creek behind. 3 more days until she would become Mrs. Harold Winters, a woman with a purpose, if not love. The bell above the general store jingled as Margaret pushed open the door. The cool interior offered a welcome respite from both the summer heat and the mockery outside. Mr. Patterson, the storekeeper, offered her a kind smile as she approached the counter. "Morning, Miss Fletcher. What can I help you with today?" "Just some thread and buttons for my trousseau, Mr. Patterson." Margaret placed her list on the counter, avoiding the curious gazes of the other customers. As Mr. Patterson gathered her items, the store door swung open with force, bringing with it a gust of wind and the commanding presence of a tall stranger. The man who entered wore a dust-covered duster, a well-worn Stetson, and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had faced far worse than a small town's judgment. "Excuse me, madam," the deep voice rumbled as the stranger reached around Margaret to place a list on the counter. His sleeve brushed against hers, and she instinctively stepped back, losing her balance slightly. A strong hand caught her elbow, steadying her. "Careful there," he said, his voice softer now. Margaret looked up into eyes the color of a summer sky set in a sun-weathered face. "Thank you," she managed, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. The stranger tipped his hat. "Name's Rylan Zane, just rode in from Butte, taking over the Flying Z ranch from my late uncle." Mr. Patterson's eyes widened. "You're Ezekiel Zane's nephew." "We've been wondering who'd take over since his passing last month." "One and the same," Rylan confirmed, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "And you are Miss Margaret Fletcher," she replied, her voice barely audible. "A pleasure, Miss Fletcher." His smile reached his eyes, crinkling the corners in a way that suggested he did it often. Margaret nodded, uncomfortable with the extended attention. She took her package from Mr. Patterson, paid, and turned to leave. As she stepped onto the boardwalk, she heard the whispers start again. 2 women from the church auxiliary stood nearby, their eyes critical as they watched her approach. "Poor Harold," one was saying, not bothering to lower her voice. "Taking on a cripple as a wife, must be desperate for someone to mind those wild children of his." Margaret quickened her pace, ignoring the pain that shot through her hip with each hurried step. She didn't see the loose board until her foot caught on it, sending her sprawling forward. Her package flew from her hands as she threw them out to break her fall. The impact with the wooden planks never came. Instead, strong arms caught her mid-fall, pulling her upright. Margaret found herself pressed against a solid chest, the scent of leather, horses, and the open prairie filling her senses. "Whoa there," Rylan Zane said, helping her regain her footing. "These boardwalks can be treacherous." The women who had been gossiping stared openly, their expressions a mixture of surprise and disapproval at the familiar way the handsome newcomer held Margaret. "Thank you, Mr. Zane," Margaret said, pulling away from his grip. "I'm quite all right." Rylan bent to retrieve her fallen package, handing it to her with a slight bow. "Any time, Miss Fletcher." He glanced at the gossiping women, his expression hardening slightly. "Madam," he acknowledged them with a curt nod before turning his attention back to Margaret. I'm heading to the Silver Spur for some lunch. Would you care to join me? I'm new in town and could use some friendly conversation. Margaret blinked in surprise. No one had ever asked to share a meal with her in public before. I don't think that would be appropriate, Mr. Zane. I'm betrothed to be married. Something flickered in Rylan's eyes, disappointment, perhaps. Congratulations are in order, then. He's a lucky man. Margaret couldn't help the bitter laugh that escaped her lips. That's not what most people think. Rylan's expression grew serious. Most people don't know what they're talking about. He tipped his hat again. Good day, Miss Fletcher. I hope to see you around town. As he walked away, Margaret stood rooted to the spot, clutching her package to her chest. For the first time in years, someone had really looked at her and seen more than just her limp. The next morning, Margaret was helping her aunt in their small kitchen when a knock came at the door. Aunt Beatrice, wiping her hands on her apron, went to answer it. Miss Fletcher. Margaret heard a familiar deep voice ask. I was hoping to speak with Margaret. Margaret's heart pounded as her aunt called her to the door. Rylan Zane stood on their porch, hat in hand, looking freshly shaven and dressed in clean clothes. Mr. Zane, Margaret acknowledged, conscious of her aunt hovering nearby. What brings you here? I've been told there's a town social tomorrow evening, he said without preamble. I was hoping you might accompany me. Margaret felt her aunt stiffen beside her. Mr. Zane, that's very kind, but as I mentioned yesterday, I'm to be married next week. To Harold Winters, Aunt Beatrice interjected. A very respectable match. Rylan's gaze flicked to the older woman briefly before returning to Margaret. With all due respect, madam, one dance at a social doesn't break a betrothal. And I could use someone to introduce me around, being new to Silver Creek. Before Margaret could refuse again, her aunt surprised her. Perhaps it would be good for Margaret to attend the social. After all, she'll be leaving us soon, and this may be her last chance to say goodbye to her friends. The look Aunt Beatrice gave her was meaningful. Margaret knew her aunt had never been enthusiastic about the match with Harold Winters, but as a widow with limited means, she couldn't support her niece indefinitely. Very well, Margaret conceded, unable to deny the flutter of excitement in her chest. I will accompany you to the social, Mr. Zane. His smile was bright enough to light the room. I'll call for you at 7 then. After he left, Aunt Beatrice gave Margaret a long look. That man rides a fine horse and wears good leather. The Flying Z is one of the biggest spreads in the territory. Harold Winters has a small farm and 5 unruly children, Margaret sighed. And a sound leg makes all the difference in a wife, Aunt B. Mr. Winters is willing to overlook my deficiency. There was a man just now who didn't seem to notice any deficiency, her aunt replied pointedly. Margaret shook her head. One evening of kindness doesn't change the world, Aunt. I've accepted Mr. Winters' proposal and I won't go back on my word. The night of the social arrived with a buzz of excitement throughout Silver Creek. The town hall had been decorated with summer wildflowers, and a small band was set up in one corner. Margaret had spent extra time preparing, wearing her best dress, a pale blue that brought out the warmth in her brown eyes, and arranging her chestnut hair in a more elaborate style than usual. When Rylan arrived to escort her, his appreciative gaze made her flush with pleasure. He offered his arm and she took it, allowing him to help her into his wagon. You look beautiful tonight, Miss Fletcher, he said as they rode toward the town hall. Thank you, she replied, smoothing her skirts nervously. I should warn you, people will talk, they always do about me. Rylan's expression hardened slightly. Let them talk, I've never much cared for gossips. At the social, heads turned as Rylan escorted Margaret into the hall. She could hear the whispers start immediately. Margaret spotted her fiancé across the room speaking with the mayor. Harold Winters was a thin, stern-looking man with graying hair and a perpetual frown. He hadn't bothered to call on her since their engagement had been arranged, stating that there would be plenty of time for conversation after they were wed. That's your betrothed? Rylan asked, following her gaze. Margaret nodded, suddenly conscious of how different the two men were. Where Harold was spare and rigid, Rylan was tall and powerful with an easy grace that belied his strength. Where Harold's eyes were cold and assessing, Rylan's were warm and kind. "Would you care to dance?" Rylan asked as the band struck up a lively tune. Margaret stiffened. "I don't dance, Mr. Zane." "Everyone dances," he countered. "Not those with a limp," she replied sharply, immediately regretting her tone. Rylan was quiet for a moment, studying her face. "I think you can do anything you set your mind to, Miss Fletcher, but we don't have to dance. Would you like some punch instead?" As the evening progressed, Margaret found herself laughing more than she had in years. Rylan was attentive and charming, introducing himself to the townspeople and always circling back to her side, as if she were the most important person in the room. Harold approached them during a lull in the music. "Margaret," he acknowledged stiffly before turning to Rylan. "Mr. Zane, I presume? I'm Harold Winters." The two men sized each other up, an unspoken tension crackling between them. "Mr. Winters," Rylan responded, his voice cool but polite, "you're a fortunate man to be marrying Miss Fletcher." Harold's thin lips tightened. "Indeed." "Though I was surprised to hear she was attending this evening. There are preparations to be made for our wedding, after all. One evening of enjoyment seems reasonable before a lifetime of commitment," Rylan replied, his smile not reaching his eyes. Margaret felt the weight of Harold's disapproval. "Mr. Zane was kind enough to escort me as he's new to town," she explained. "How considerate," Harold replied, his tone suggesting otherwise. "I trust you'll remember your obligations, Margaret. The ceremony is in 2 days' time." After Harold walked away, Rylan turned to Margaret. "Is that truly the man you wish to marry?" Margaret looked down at her hands. "Wishes have little to do with it, Mr. Zane. Mr. Winters is offering me security and a position as mother to his children. That's more than most women in my situation can hope for." "Your situation?" Rylan questioned, his voice gentle. "You know what I mean," Margaret replied, gesturing vaguely toward her leg. "Few men would consider a wife who can't even walk properly." Something flashed in Rylan's eyes, anger but not directed at her. "Come with me," he said suddenly, offering his arm. "Where?" "Outside. The music's too loud for proper conversation." Curious, Margaret allowed him to lead her onto the town hall's wide porch. The summer night was warm, with a crescent moon hanging above the distant mountains. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the chirping of crickets and the muffled music from inside. "I lost my father when I was 12, Rylan said finally. "He was thrown from a horse during a cattle drive. Before he died, he told me something I've never forgotten. He said, 'Son, in this life, it's not about having a perfect path to walk. It's about finding someone who'll walk your path with you, whatever that looks like.'" He turned to face Margaret fully. "I don't see a woman with a limp, Margaret. I see a woman with courage, dignity, and a smile that lights up a room when she allows it to." Margaret's throat tightened with emotion. "You barely know me, Mr. Zane." "I'd like the chance to change that," he replied simply. "Don't marry him." Margaret's eyes widened. "You can't ask that of me. What would I do instead?" "Where would I go? Marry me instead," Rylan said, the words falling between them like stones in still water. Margaret gasped. "That's absurd. You're proposing to a woman you met 2 days ago." "I'm proposing to a woman who deserves better than to settle for a loveless marriage to a man who sees her as nothing more than a convenient solution to his problems." Rylan took her hands in his. "I'm not claiming to love you yet, Margaret. But I respect you, and I believe we could build something real together." Margaret pulled her hands away, tears threatening. "You're being kind, Mr. Zane, but this isn't a dime novel. People like me don't get fairy tale endings." "People like you?" Rylan questioned. "You mean people with courage and integrity, because that's what I see when I look at you." Before Margaret could respond, the door to the hall opened and several couples spilled out onto the porch, laughing and talking. The moment was broken. "I should go inside," Margaret said, avoiding Rylan's gaze. "Aunt Beatrice will be wondering where I am." Rylan nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'll take you home whenever you're ready, Miss Fletcher." The ride back to her aunt's house was quiet, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. When they arrived, Rylan helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for a lovely evening, Mr. Zane," Margaret said formally. "Rylan," he corrected. "After a proposal, I think we can use first names, don't you?" A small smile tugged at Margaret's lips despite herself. "Good night, Rylan." "This isn't goodbye, Margaret," he said as she turned to go. "I don't give up that easily." The next morning, Margaret was helping her aunt prepare for the wedding when a commotion outside drew them to the window. Harold Winters was striding up the path to their door, his face thunderous. "Oh dear," Aunt Beatrice murmured. "This can't be good." Harold didn't bother knocking, instead bursting through the door with barely contained fury. "Is it true?" he demanded of Margaret. "Did you spend the entire social last night in the company of that cowboy?" Margaret straightened her spine. "Mr. Zane escorted me to the social, yes, as a friend." "A friend," Harold sneered. "The whole town is talking about how he couldn't take his eyes off you, how he practically declared his intentions in front of everyone." "That's hardly," Margaret began, but Harold cut her off. "I won't be made a fool of, Margaret. I'm offering you a position most women with your affliction could only dream of. If you can't show proper gratitude and respect, perhaps we should reconsider this arrangement." Aunt Beatrice stepped forward. "Now, Mr. Winters, surely there's been a misunderstanding. Margaret has been preparing diligently for your wedding." Harold looked between the two women, his thin face pinched with displeasure. "I expect absolute loyalty and obedience from my wife, Margaret. If you can't provide that, say so now." Something shifted in Margaret at that moment. The fear that had kept her compliant, that had made her accept a life with this cold, demanding man, began to dissolve. "And what loyalty and obedience have you shown me, Harold? You've never once asked what I might want or need in a marriage. You've never even pretended affection." Harold's face flushed with anger. "What you need is irrelevant. I'm offering you a home in my name, which is more than you deserve." "More than I deserve," Margaret repeated, her voice gaining strength. "Because I walk with a limp, does that make me less worthy of respect and kindness?" "Don't be dramatic," Harold snapped. "I'm being practical, you should be grateful." "No," Margaret said, the word falling from her lips like a stone. "I won't marry you, Harold, not tomorrow, not ever." Harold's eyes widened in shock. "You'll regret this decision, Margaret. No one else will have you. You'll end up alone, a burden to your aunt until she passes, and then what will become of you?" Before Margaret could respond, another voice joined the conversation. "She won't be alone." All three turned to find Rylan standing in the doorway, his expression thunderous as he took in the scene. "This is a private conversation," Harold said coldly. "Not when you're threatening the woman I intend to marry," Rylan replied, moving to stand beside Margaret. Harold let out a bark of laughter. "You marry her, you barely know her." "I know enough," Rylan said simply. "I know she deserves better than a man who sees her as damaged goods." Harold's face contorted with rage. "You're making a mistake, Zane. She'll be nothing but a burden to you." Rylan's voice was dangerously quiet when he replied. "I suggest you leave now, Mr. Winters, before I forget the manners my mother taught me." For a moment, it seemed Harold might argue further, but something in Rylan's steady gaze must have convinced him otherwise. With a final glare at Margaret, he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. In the silence that followed, Aunt Beatrice looked between Margaret and Rylan with wide eyes. "Well," she finally said, "I believe I need to check on something in the kitchen." She hurried out, leaving the two alone. "Did you mean it?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "About marrying me?" "Every word," Rylan confirmed, taking a step toward her. "But I don't want you to agree because you feel you have no other choice. That would make me no better than him." Margaret searched his face, looking for any sign of pity or obligation. She found none, only warmth, admiration, and something that might, with time, grow into love. "I can't offer you perfection, Rylan. My leg will never be strong. There will be days when I struggle to walk, when I need help." Rylan closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. Walk beside me anyway, Margaret, strong days and difficult ones. I don't need perfection, I just need you, exactly as you are. Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes. You hardly know me. Then give me the time to learn you, he replied softly. Let me court you properly. Let me show you that your worth isn't measured by how you walk, but by who you are. Margaret's heart swelled with an unfamiliar hope. I would like that very much. Rylan's smile was bright enough to chase away the shadows of doubt that had plagued her for so long. Then that's where we'll start. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of discovery. True to his word, Rylan courted Margaret with a gentle persistence that both surprised and delighted her. He brought flowers when he called, listened intently when she spoke, and never once treated her limp as anything other than a simple fact, like the color of her eyes or the sound of her laugh. He took her to see the Flying Z Ranch, introducing her to the hands who worked for him and showing her the spacious ranch house his uncle had built. It needs a woman's touch, he admitted as they stood in the large, somewhat sparse main room. Uncle Ezekiel was a bachelor his whole life, and it shows. It's beautiful, Margaret said honestly, admiring the solid craftsmanship and the large windows that looked out over the rolling prairie. As summer turned to fall, Margaret found herself falling deeply in love with Rylan. He was everything Harold Winters was not: kind, considerate, and genuinely interested in her thoughts and feelings. And most miraculous of all, he never seemed to notice her limp unless she was struggling, and then he offered his arm without comment, supporting her without making her feel weak. They were walking by the creek one crisp October afternoon, the trees ablaze with autumn colors, when Rylan stopped and turned to her. Do you remember the first thing I ever said to you, after I caught you from falling in front of the general store? Margaret smiled at the memory. You said the boardwalks could be treacherous. Rylan shook his head. Before that, I said whoa there like you were a spirited filly about to bolt. He laughed at himself. Not very romantic, was it? I thought it was kind, Margaret replied honestly. Most people would have let me fall. Rylan's expression grew serious. I would never let you fall, Margaret. Not then, not now, not ever. He took both her hands in his. These past months have been the happiest of my life. I meant what I said that day at your aunt's house. I want to marry you. Not out of pity or convenience, but because I've fallen in love with you. Margaret's heart soared at his words. I love you too, Rylan, more than I ever thought possible. He dropped to one knee, wincing slightly as it hit the hard ground. Margaret Fletcher, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Will you walk beside me for all our days as I walk beside you? Tears of joy blurred Margaret's vision as she nodded. Yes, Rylan. Yes, I will. They were married on a bright November day, with the mountains dusted with the first snow of the season. The entire town turned out for the wedding, many of the same people who had once mocked Margaret now offering genuine congratulations. Aunt Beatrice wept happy tears as she watched her niece, radiant in a simple white gown, pledge her life to Rylan. As they danced at their wedding reception, yes, danced, for Rylan had spent weeks teaching Margaret simple steps that accommodated her limp. Margaret caught sight of Harold Winters watching from the corner. His expression was unreadable, but he gave her a curt nod before slipping out the door. Any regrets? Rylan asked, noticing the direction of her gaze. Margaret shook her head, tightening her arms around her husband's neck. Not a single one. Even though I step on your toes, he teased, purposely making an exaggerated misstep that made her laugh. Even then, she assured him. Especially then. Life at the Flying Z wasn't without its challenges. Running a cattle ranch was hard work, and there were days when Margaret's leg ached so badly she could barely move. But Rylan was always there, supporting her without smothering her, encouraging her to rest when needed but never treating her as an invalid. The first winter was particularly harsh, with blizzards that lasted days and temperatures that dropped well below zero. During one severe storm, 2 of the ranch hands were caught out checking on the herd. When they didn't return by nightfall, Rylan prepared to go search for them, despite Margaret's concern. I can't leave them out there, he explained as he pulled on his heavy coat and gloves. They might not survive the night, Margaret nodded, understanding his sense of responsibility. Be careful, she urged, helping him wrap a wool scarf around his neck. Come back to me, he kissed her firmly. Always. The hours of his absence were the longest of Margaret's life. She paced the ranch house, ignoring the pain in her leg, praying for his safe return. When she finally heard horses in the yard, she rushed to the door, relief flooding through her at the sight of Rylan helping one of the hands, who was clearly injured, down from his horse. Together, they tended to the frostbitten ranch hand and got both men warmed up and fed. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Rylan pulled Margaret close. Thank you, he murmured into her hair. For what? For being here, for making this house a home, for giving me someone to come back to. Margaret pressed a kiss to his chest, right over his heart. Thank you for always coming back. As the seasons changed and their life together deepened, Margaret discovered strengths she never knew she possessed. She learned to ride astride rather than side saddle, finding that it actually put less strain on her weak leg. She took over the ranch accounts, revealing a head for numbers that improved their profits. And when influenza swept through the territory in their second year of marriage, it was Margaret who nursed not only Rylan but several of the ranch hands back to health. You're the strongest person I know, Rylan told her one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and pink. Not despite your limp, but altogether. Margaret smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. We're strong together, that's what matters. In the spring of their third year of marriage, Margaret discovered she was with child. The news was met with equal parts joy and fear at the prospect of expanding their family, fear about how her body would handle the strain of pregnancy and childbirth. The town doctor was cautiously optimistic. Many women with conditions similar to yours have healthy pregnancies, Mrs. Zane. We'll monitor you closely. Rylan was a rock throughout the pregnancy, taking on extra work to allow Margaret more rest, massaging her aching leg each night, and never once expressing doubt in her ability to bring their child into the world. Their daughter, Elizabeth Beatrice Zane, was born on a warm June morning after a difficult but ultimately successful labor. As Margaret held their tiny daughter, her heart so full it might burst, Rylan sat beside them on the bed, one arm around his wife, the other gently stroking his daughter's downy head. She's perfect, he whispered, awe evident in his voice. She is, Margaret agreed, marveling at the tiny fingers and rosebud lips. Do you think she'll have your eyes? I hope she has your courage, Rylan replied, pressing a kiss to Margaret's temple. Your strength. As Elizabeth grew, it became clear that she had inherited her father's strong constitution. She walked early, ran everywhere, and showed no signs of her mother's condition. Margaret watched her daughter's easy movements with gratitude, even as she sometimes felt a pang of what might have been for herself. Rylan, ever perceptive, noticed her wistful expression one day as they watched 4-year-old Elizabeth racing across the yard. She's beautiful in motion, isn't she? He commented, slipping an arm around Margaret's waist. She is, Margaret agreed. I'm so thankful she doesn't have my difficulties. Rylan turned her to face him. Elizabeth is perfect as she is. Just as you are perfect as you are, your limp doesn't diminish you, Margaret. It never has. Tears pricked at Margaret's eyes. How do you always know exactly what I need to hear? Because I know you, he replied simply. I see you, all of you, and I love every part. When Elizabeth was 5, Margaret gave birth to their son, Thomas Rylan Zane. Unlike his sister, Thomas was a quiet, thoughtful child who preferred books to running. As he grew, it became apparent that he had inherited a slight weakness in his right leg, not as pronounced as Margaret's, but noticeable in his gait. The realization filled Margaret with guilt. I've passed it to him, she confessed to Rylan one night after the children were asleep. He'll face the same mockery I did. Rylan took her hands firmly in his. No, he won't. Because he has us parents who will teach him that his worth isn't measured by how perfectly he walks, but by the path he chooses to walk. And he has a sister who adores him and will defend him fiercely. Margaret nodded, drawing strength from Rylan's unwavering support. "You're right. We'll make sure he knows how much he's loved." And they did. As Thomas grew, he did indeed face some teasing from other children, but he weathered it with a quiet dignity that made Margaret proud. Elizabeth, true to Rylan's prediction, was her brother's fiercest defender, once bloodying the nose of a boy who had called Thomas a cripple. "That's not how we solve problems," Margaret admonished her daughter afterward, though she couldn't entirely hide her pride. "It's how Dad would have solved it," Elizabeth retorted with a grin that was pure Rylan. As the years passed, the Flying Z prospered under Rylan and Margaret's careful stewardship. They added more land, built a larger barn, and became known throughout the territory for their fair business practices and quality cattle. The ranch house, once sparse and bachelor-like, became a warm and welcoming home filled with books, music, and laughter. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Rylan surprised Margaret with a trip to San Francisco, a city she had always longed to see. They left the ranch in the capable hands of Elizabeth, now 23 and as skilled with cattle as her father, and Thomas, 18, and showing a keen business mind. In San Francisco, they attended the opera, dined in fine restaurants, and walked arm in arm along the waterfront. On their last evening, as they stood watching the sunset over the Pacific Ocean, Rylan turned to Margaret with the same smile that had captured her heart 2 decades earlier. "Any regrets?" he asked, echoing the question he had posed at their wedding. Margaret looked up at the man who had changed her life with 6 simple words. "Walk beside me anyway." The years had added silver to his hair and lines around his eyes, but he was still the most handsome man she had ever known. "Not a single one," she replied, standing on tiptoe to kiss him. "Every step with you has been worth taking." Rylan wrapped his arms around her, holding her close as the last rays of sun gilded the water. "And we have many more to take, my love, many more to take."